thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to this panel hosted by the Honors Program on Disinformation, Misinformation, and Democracy. And it is indeed a conversation we have to have. It really is difficult to imagine a more timely topic for discussion with the remarkable confluence of a pandemic, the social unrest, and the election. We have been bombarded with information, the truth of which is practically impossible to determine without an inordinate amount of time and effort. Dr. Hicks-Goldston approached me last year about holding such a panel in view of the upcoming election, and I was happy to offer to host this through the Honors Program. We could not have foreseen the remarkable chain of events of the last 7 months, events that have clearly heightened the importance of holding such a panel. And as citizens and voters in a democratic society, we have a responsibility to be informed, and this panel will help us to do so. So, Christina, while I am disappointed that I cannot offer the usual hospitality of the Honors Commons, I'm certainly glad that we decided to go ahead with this, what should be a really enlightening and informative discussion. So I want to thank our three speakers for taking the time to prepare and present their thoughts, and thank also Karen Bullis, who will be working behind the scenes to prepare this panel for viewing on APSU-TV. It is my pleasure to introduce the three speakers, and I think I'm just going to go ahead and introduce all of you so that we can move right through. Does that make sense?
That's great.
Dr. Christina Hicks-Goldston is an associate professor of communication whose areas of research are popular culture, gender studies, and diversity. As is true also for Dr. Nichols, she serves on the APSU Service Learning Advisory Board and is also the graduate coordinator for the Department of Communication. Dr. Tracy Nichols served as the advisor to the Communication Department's conditionally admitted students. She is the library liaison, also the Mid-Sweden coordinator, Go Study Abroad. She is the online speaking coordinator, a faculty senator for the College of Arts and Letters, member of the Service Learning Board, and served as the undergraduate coordinator for the Department of Communications. Dr. Nichols has a passion for high impact practices and teaches multiple service learning classes. In the fall of 2012, she revitalized the Honors public speaking class as a new service learning opportunity. And in addition, she teaches a service learning study abroad class that spends time with nonprofit organizations locally and then works with the same organizations on a global level during a spring break program in London. Professor Amy Ritchart is a journalist and assistant professor of journalism. Her research areas include media literacy, narrative journalism, women and the mass media, and journalism education. Thank you again for your time and for sharing your expertise with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. We appreciate the opportunity. This is awesome. Thank you. I also need to mention that one of my graduate students, Kamea Ferguson, is here tonight. Kamea and I had a class together in the spring of 2019. I'm gonna back up a little bit, about 2 years, to the spring of 2019. And which Amy Ritchart, Professor Ritchart, and I were talking about how much disinformation and misinformation was out there. She coming from a journalism perspective, me coming from a mass media popular culture perspective. And Amy and I could not believe the spread of information so fast, so much information, so many times, like I said, either disinformation or misinformation. And at the time, I was teaching a communication theory class, and we have a whole section on propaganda. And I began to add the propaganda information with the disinformation so that my students would start being educated in what to look for. And Kamea was in that class. And so now 2 years later, she's a graduate student and she's still interested, as I am, in how much that information is out there. And so Kamea and I'm going to ask her a few questions about, we specifically discussed the interference in the Black Lives Matter movement in 2016 into the present. It has continued. But this particular topic is, it never stops. When I was trying to get articles about disinformation and misinformation, not just from an academic perspective, but also from just a popular culture and journalism perspective, I have something like 50 articles none of them are older than 3 years. So, I mean, it's just constantly in the news. And it's always an issue in an election year, because we are talking about a democracy, our democracy, and we have social media is a wonderful thing. It is made as part of the global village, but it also has allowed for there to be a lot of misinformation and disinformation for a variety of reasons that we're going to discuss tonight. And then, of all things, right at the time that Tim and I were discussing having this conference, hello COVID. Who would have thought? Couldn't have picked that one out of a script, you know. And so one of the things we wanted to talk about was the COVID-19 experience, the pandemic, and the misinformation and disinformation that is out there, which might not seem to be a direct relationship with a democracy. But you know what? When you got a lot of sick people around without proper information, then it is actually a health condition of the country type of situation. And finally, in addition to some of these other topics, the rise of organizations such as QAnon, in which there is an entirely separate narrative about what's going on in current events that is considered disinformation. And I discussed with Amy, and she was talking about how difficult it is to report on that and not be part of the spread. So we have several things that we wanted to talk about tonight, and that's hopefully we can answer questions and provide illumination. That's our goal. And so I just wanted to ask, Tracy, would you like to start with yours, or Amy, would you like to start with yours, or do you want me to start with mine?
Why don't you start first, Chris, to give
Okay.
a backdrop, the political backdrop?
Okay. Thank you. I'm being fair here. I just want to make sure we all have a chance at the floor. Okay. Well, like I said, what drew me to this sort of line of research that I was so interested in 2 years ago is I subscribed to the magazine, The New Yorker. And so I picked up The New Yorker, and it was February of 2019, and it talks about a report that had been given to the Senate Intelligence Committee about the Internet Research Agency. And I, like many people, many voters, many Americans, I had never heard of the Internet Research Agency, whose initials are the IRA. And I thought, well, that's a retirement account. Why do I care about that? That's because the Internet Research Agency is a Russian-created organization whose sole purpose is to distribute disinformation and meddle in other countries' affairs. And when I read the article and I figured out who they were, that because they've done an entire dossier on them, and I have a visual aid later that I will show you guys, but not at this moment. I began to read how this is a very elaborate organization. They go and take a look at social media activity. They look at people's profiles. They look at people's interests. They look at what hot button issues are. And then they begin to craft memes and fake accounts and fake organizations, you name it. And then they sort of target these individuals to try to kind of stoke the fire, so to speak. If someone's already interested in one thing, then they sort of push them a little further. And we were by no means, when they began working actively in this country, they weren't formed, I believe, until 2014. And they began kind of interfering in our social media in 2015. And they have continued to do so. And what I found was this is just sort of a thing that they can do because they've been doing it for many years in other parts of Europe, these disinformation campaigns. And I remembered back in 2017, I loved Vice News Tonight. I always watched Vice News Tonight on HBO. And Vice News Tonight had gone over to the Ukraine and found a single college with a journalism department and some students, and there were only 20 faculty and students who had started doing a broadcast every night to local viewers there in the Ukraine. Truly, the whole point of the show was a rundown. Here's the lies we got from Russia today. Here's what they sent over here today, and we're going to disprove why this is a falsehood. And it was fascinating to me that they had just this one college, this one small community had organized to say, we realize there's this huge machine over here in a neighboring country directly interfering with our activities, but we're not going to let it happen. We're going to be the voice that says fact check And that's what they were spending their time. They had no dollars given to them. They were operating out of a university TV studio, and that's how they were working. It was just actively, having the truth there, sort of as the, every time that one of these lies was spread, or some of this disinformation was spread, they were there to say, we caught you in that. And I was fascinated that this has to be like an ongoing action. And I realized that in this country, we've never had anything like that. And so for us, we're in a brave new territory. We're not in a place where we're used to having to go out and constantly fact check all of our information, because for us, it's a relatively new thing. As recently as March 28th, 2020, China had joined Russia, and was there a large percentage of the China disinformation sent our way was on COVID. And obviously that's a very sensitive topic with COVID. And so the government had crafted a lot of messages about COVID's origins, how we were responding to it, and all of these things really within the first month of our response nationally to COVID-19, as we began to realize what was going on and how much we were going to have to learn about this condition, this virus, really fast. And so they kind of got up their game. And then recently, I don't remember if it was the Washington Post or the New York Times, said Iraq sort of watched how this disinformation can work via social media, and they were also interested in creating some of their own memes and information. But in the past, I'm going to do one screen share. I told you guys I had my one visual aid, so this is my visual aid. The publication is called The Tactics and Tropes of the Internet Research Agency. And this is one piece of that. It was, I wish I still had it up there. I thought I did, but it's basically a list of, there we go. So let me just tell you from what I can see. They had a list in which they say interest, and they go down the list of interests. Martin Luther King, African American Civil Rights Movement, Black Power, Gun Owners of America, National Rifles Association. And they would just go through and find these particular groups that they were, that they had decided were actually wanting a voice and wanting some sort of dialogue on social media. And once they had targeted that group, then all of the fake ads came in, and all of the fake memes came in, and all of the information was there to divert and mislead and excite and sort of agitate the reader or viewer. And so this began, like I said, in 2015 and just continues to this day. And one of the key things that we need to know about why this activity, you may say, well, Christina, Dr. HG, why isn't anyone doing anything about this? It's a very important thing that most of us don't know if we're not in our communication law class with Doc V. And that is, foreign ownership of radio and television stations was always prohibited because we were afraid of there being some sort of propaganda efforts, some sort of attack on our democracy by foreign agents. So we always said our broadcasting system had to remain ours. It could not be foreign owned, because we needed to be in control of the message being sent out there. But we didn't make a law for social media. We didn't expand that law to start incorporating, the activities out there on the internet, social media, all of these messages that are constantly coming and going. Now, there is legislation proposed in both the House and the Senate, and anybody who is interested in that information, we can get, in the question and answer session, I can give you the name of those bills. But anyway, there is legislation that was partially proposed, I believe, by the late Senator John McCain in the Senate. And I don't remember who proposed it in the House of Representatives. But the point is, it would bring social media into the fold. It would bring internet activity in the fold. And it would say, if you are going to have some sort of ad, if you're going to have some sort of website, if you're going to be generating social media activity, we need a name. We need a real physical location. We need to prove that this is not just a bot. And that is where we are right now, is we need to make sure that we know where the origin, where are these products, if you will, and messages and entertainment, where is it coming from? Who has actually put it there, and what is this organization? And so it's definitely something that we had to have the law, and we sort of had to have the national consciousness catch up to the fact that it was out there. There are other organizations, like I said, China and Iraq are on the world stage, but there is another organization called the Side Group, And they're an Israeli private intelligence agency that participates in this as well. I mean, it is an art form to create this sort of fake movement, if you will, of mobilizing people with all of this information. Two things have happened in the last year that have sort of changed things. In the past, these people were actual physical people who were charged with creating an account and sort of following its activity overseas. You actually had these operators, these, IT types who, that was what they did. They worked for these intelligence agencies. They kept the home fires stirred up, so to speak. They were constantly posting, constantly keeping people active. And you would just have all these operatives working on a particular account. Now, one of the latest developments is you don't need operatives anymore if you have bots that you can actually teach to write exactly like a particular person. One of the things that I was really fascinated by is an article from last month in The Atlantic, and it's the introduction of a thing called the Generative Pre-Trained Transformer, or GPT-3. And the GPT-3 is an artificial intelligence that can be taught to write at a, say, junior level and mimic anyone's style of writing. And in fact, they confess in the article that the GPT-3 wrote a paragraph, and then they show you the paragraph they wrote, and you wouldn't know it's a bot, okay? And so what they figured out is now propaganda doesn't even have to come from operatives. Propaganda can come from educated bots. So we have to be able to figure out, and they said the thing is, they are not sophisticated enough. By the time you let them go for, say, a couple of pages, they just kind of start rambling and it doesn't read anymore like something that you would think is written by a person. It does sort of go off into it doesn't yet have the ability to mimic us creating an entire paper or an article, but it is out there and it exists, and it negates the reason to have any sort of operatives or people do this. So it's something that you have to think about and sort of be aware of, that yes, that is possible to duplicate someone else's writing style or, create accounts and not necessarily have a real person. And they figured this out when certain magazines said they kept getting these articles submitted. And one of them was a left-wing publication. And they said this Alice, I think it was like Alice Gonzalez or whatever. So Alice Gonzalez keeps sending these articles in, and they said maybe in the course of a year, they published maybe 3 of her articles. And then for whatever reason, they hear about the fact that there are these artificial bots who are writing these things on social media, who are writing these blogs, who are writing these things, that are starting to get information. And they said, but when they go to LinkedIn, they can't really find Alice. There's a photo, but then they realize that Alice could also be a photo that was generated on a site like This Person Does Not Exist. If you go to thispersondoesnotexist.com, then it's always an image of a person who has been created, within the computer. It's not a real person. And then they said this is possible. They can just go and have this image of this non-person be Alice. And so then they start trying to track down other publications that Alice has written for, and they find that even the publications that Alice has written for are not real publications. And what happened after they began to investigate certain stories like this, they immediately disappear. Once they figured out that you figured out Alice doesn't exist, they disappear. So it takes a certain amount of savvy to figure out how to vet a writer. And the last tool of misinformation and disinformation is also tricking legitimate writers. Recently, the Internet Research Agency looked at all of these people that were starting writing careers and wanting to get published. And my heart went out to them as an academic, because we're always wanting to get published and have our work published. And they realized that when they got with a group called Peace Data, Peace Data was recently busted for being part of the IRA, because they were soliciting writers all over the country. They were asking them to write certain things, and when the person would submit the article, they would send a response back in kind of broken English that no, they didn't really care for that slant of the article. They would really like to see them take it in another direction, and they would be sort of slowly but surely kind of getting them to write propaganda. And the journalists said they began to figure this out. And so when they started, questioning whether or not this, especially when the person that was doing the editing was in a different kind of syntax was off and the language was not correct, and yet this person was supposedly an editor of a magazine. So they began to figure this out, and they said, that's when I felt like I needed to get away from these people and get away fast. But these stories came in from the United States, from the UK, from other countries where writers had been duped into writing a kind of propaganda. So one of the things I found when I started to look at all of these things is this is definitely something that is a full-time occupation for one side, and yet the people receiving this information, it's not a full-time occupation for us to constantly vet what we're reading. Things come at us too fast. Things are happening too fast. We don't necessarily want to take the time to decide, is what I'm reading real or imagined? And so I feel like Professor Ritchart and I proposed 2 years ago that we should have a global organization where we do employ people full time to do what one little college did in the Ukraine, and that is rebuff this, try to diffuse the disinformation. And if you're asking yourself, well, Dr. Hicks-Goldston, Christina, whichever it is, what is the difference between disinformation and misinformation? There's really not a lot, because disinformation is trying to give people false information or mislead. Misinformation is giving false information and not really bothering to check if what you're saying is accurate or true. You may not have intent to harm or give, a false truth, but at the same time, didn't bother to check either. And both of them sort of floating around out there, not really being checked, and no one really looking to do something about this, is why it is a problem. And I don't believe you ever introduce a problem without a solution. One of the things that Professor Ritchart and I talked about is there would be a way to organize and counter this, but you have to be aware it's happening, and you have to be willing to do the time, take the time to do the vetting. If you don't bother to do the vetting, you're probably not going to be able to find this out. I want to make sure that I'm not going over on my time. So I've spoken enough where I think I've taken up my 20 minutes before I turn it over to some other people. So I will trade off for now and maybe come back later and talk to Kamea a little bit and maybe answer some questions. But anyway, my proposal is that we have to become media literate, that we have to recognize it's out there, and there are things we can do. There are ways for us to figure this out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina.
Dr. Nichols, do you want to take over from here?
Sure. When Dr. HG first approached me with being a part of this wonderful idea for a panel, my original topic was vaccinations and anti-vaxxers and misinformation and disinformation. And then the pandemic hit. And as Dr. Winters said when he introduced us, we could not have asked for, well, we didn't ask for any of this, but it's so timely that we have these discussions now. And so we decided that I would shift my focus to COVID-19 and the pandemic, and also to look at how this happened. And I think that, again, Dr. Winters briefly mentioned, it's a perfect storm. What we have here was a perfect storm. So how did a medical worldwide pandemic, a health crisis event, become one nation's political divide? So I'm going to look at some historical things, some personal perspectives, and just share some very interesting information that I found that changes. It's so fluid. When you talk about COVID, I was hearing new things last night about misinformation and disinformation. And then on my way in this afternoon, NPR had a very brand new thing. So it's a very fluid and changing environment, and the information can be very confusing at times. So I think that by nature, we are emotional. Whether you're overtly emotional or whether you keep your emotions inside, we are emotional. And with this in mind, it can be very hard for us to be objective. And when we attach emotions to our response to information and events, we tend to lack objectional perspective. And objectional perspective allows us to critically and carefully evaluate events. So just by nature, we already have, potential issues. Today, our divided society tends to look for people who think like we think. And this action is incredibly polarizing, and it can keep us from what I call the gray area. And that's the place where we're in the middle, where there are truths on both sides and things are not so extreme or so polarized. So when we think of extremes and in polarization, we tend to miss the big picture of what's happening, whether it's locally, nationally, or internationally. Dr. HG mentioned social media and memes, and I think that we definitely are a meme culture right now. It's given us platforms to have more exposure, but also more tunnel vision, so that with so many opportunities to find things, often we tend to gravitate toward that which is that which is similar to our own personal belief system. And when we do that, again, if we don't move beyond our own personal frame of reference, the experiences that have led us to be who we are, again, this can make our thoughts and actions lack that careful and critical evaluation that's so needed to make sense of what's happening. Another thing to consider is that thoughts and actions can be generational. So if your parents or family grew up watching Channel 4 news your whole life, chances are that you watched it until something changed for you. That can also go for things like bread. My uncle worked for Bunny Bread, and so that's all that we ate when I was growing up until I found out, wow, there is a plethora of breads and they're all delicious. So it's exposure to things that are different from your own experiences. And I think, therefore, it makes sense that if your family strongly supports one political party, you tend to support this political party because it's what you know and what you've been exposed to. For Gen Z, which many of you are, you've grown up in a world of social media, and this is where you get your news, if you even pay attention or seek news. Your worldview has been framed by young adult novels that focus on destruction, post-apocalyptic societies, and conspiracy theories. So you have more options for media consumption than any generation before you. And again, while this is a wonderful thing, it can also create challenges to seeking out things that are different from like. So we add to this the fact that people tend not to like change. We like to have consistency. We like to know what's going to happen as a whole. And 2020 has brought us a significant amount of change, and it keeps happening. To the point where all of our memes are jokes about 2020 and satire about 2020. And some of the things that we find, if we cling to answers that bring us comfort, they may not be factually driven. And so those are things to consider too. That perfect storm in America that made a pandemic, a global pandemic, political. It's not the first time that it's happened. With SARS, with Zika and Ebola, there were political aspects attached to it, but this is the first time that we've seen such a polarization and such a political attachment to a pandemic. We have social unrest in our country. We have economic issues. We have a presidential campaign year. Again, a perfect storm of a lot of things to make something that we would maybe look at differently in another year in a way where there's misinformation and disinformation that we might cling to. People also have a sense of medical distrust. So you want to find answers that make sense to you, even if they aren't scientifically based, because you want that sense of comfort and a sense of making the world right, that the world makes sense. And sometimes that can lead us down a path of embracing disinformation or misinformation. I think one of the first things to consider with COVID-19 is that if we are going to think about this critically and carefully, we have to consider multiple sources. So you can't just rely on one source for your information. You have to consider multiple sources. So that's going to help you look beyond yourself and your own personal frame of reference when we include credible sources that may not support just what we believe. There are ways that we can recognize disinformation or misinformation. One of those is the narratives that are put out in front of us, propaganda techniques. Dr. H.G. mentioned propaganda. There are several examples of propaganda that I'll share with you a little bit later that we've experienced just over the past few days with the president and his hospitalization and then his release from the hospital. Also, I think that it's very important that we avoid selective sharing in a crisis. So we have a national health crisis with COVID-19. So it's important that we give the sense of transparency, full transparency, so that we don't just selectively share information. Whether it's good or bad, people need to know what's happening in a pandemic. One of the most important things that I think that should be shared with this is that you have to follow the science. The science in a pandemic, the factual events of the pandemic, the guidelines that are put forth by credible medical and scientific sources are what is going to help you move through that medical crisis, that national and global health crisis. So it shouldn't be about politics, but the reality of it is that it can be now and is. Another thing too is that, when I talked about change and how we don't like change, since this is a new virus, we're constantly learning new things about it. And so I think that we may even look back 20 years from now and see things differently because this is new and we're experiencing it as it happens. It's not just for America, it's, for the entire world. So I mentioned follow the science. We have to be diligent in listening to credible sources and scientific and medical sources that are credible. Where health is concerned for me, these would be the CDC. Their database is tremendous. Last fall, the honors program had a class on zombies that was fantastic. And in that class, the Drs. Thompson talked about how it's important to believe in the CDC because they have such a large database and they're credible. I concur with this belief 100%. Even though they're going to make mistakes, as any organization can, we just have to realize that they are moving through this pandemic as new information becomes available. Although I won't discuss it in depth here, the World Health Organization is also a fantastic resource. They have been historically trusted, and they have a very nice timeline that if we were doing a traditional face-to-face presentation, I would share with you, but I encourage you, if you're interested in the pandemic and the timeline of the pandemic, to look at that. It's a very good one. Another nice timeline that was created was by the American Journal of Managed Care, and it takes things through, and it's very detailed, so you get a sense of where we started with this and where we are now. And I think that that kind of perspective is also good. So in addition to the CDC and the World Health Organization, I also think that the Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, the National Institute for Health, and then the leaders that the government brought in initially to talk to us, Drs. Fauci and Birx, who are renowned in their specific areas, whether it is infectious disease or global pandemics. So those are the people, just to give you an encapsulated group of people that could be trusted, credible sources. When you're looking at doctors and other information that you might find on social media and on the internet, it's important to make sure that they have the background to speak on the issue. So a psychologist can speak to the mental health concerns a pandemic brings on, but they may not have the background to discuss the specific items related to an infectious disease. So those are things that I think are very important when we talk about critical evaluation of information and carefully looking at what's out there. I also think it's important, as Dr. H.G. said, we have to look for agendas, whether these agendas are blatant, where they're right there and we can see them immediately, or whether they're hidden. It's very important for us to not rely on that one single resource for all of our answers. And in a crisis, in crisis communication, is something that I teach. One of the things that I said earlier was transparency. You have to be transparent transparent with whoever your audience is. And for us, this would be the American public with COVID-19. But you also have to provide clear and concise information. So you don't want to have information or wording that's very generic or just very non-specific. We have to make sure that people understand what's going on, that we know what the guidelines are, we understand them, and that we do our best to follow them. Dr. Fauci said recently that with COVID-19, it spreads rapidly and easily. The full spectrum of symptoms and health effects is only just beginning to be cataloged, much less understood. So it's something like that. It's interesting to me, and again, I think it's this perfect storm that we're in, that things are so partisan when it affects everyone, not just what party you belong to. So there are a couple of nonpartisan fact-checking websites, and Professor Ritchart may mention some of these in her discussion too, I'm not sure. But one is AP Fact Check, and then there's Fact Tank News and the Numbers, which is the Pew Research Center. So again, very important things is to look for credible sources and to do your work. And I know we're all exhausted and we don't want to work at it. We just want to see it and read it. But for us to be informed citizens, it is imperative that we make the time to make sure that what we consume with the media and with information from our government, state, local, federal, everywhere is as accurate as possible. I think that the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions provided a fantastic list of how to spot disinformation and misinformation. And again, one is to consider the source we've talked about and to check the author to see who they are. Like Dr. HG said, are they even real or are they a bot? Then your supporting sources. If somebody lists a source, check that to make sure it's a real thing. Don't just read through and assume that it's real. And then another thing is, if it's too crazy, even in 2020, it might be a joke. It might be satire on the situation, because sometimes we move through our most horrific experiences through satire and humor. And so that's something to consider. And another thing that we often don't think about are our own biases, the things that each of us have that make us look at the world the way that we do, that may not be an accurate reflection of things. And so that kind of self-reflection and self-awareness can be very beneficial as you absorb the information that you're presented. In August of this year, the American Medical Association did research on misinformation and mixed signals about masks. I think that if we boil this down in COVID, one of the big things would be masks and social distancing. They said that even though the science is there, that people still continue to dismiss the value of masks. Masks are essential to preventing spread, and it's not a political statement. It's okay for you to wear them for long periods of time, according to the American Medical Association and Dr. Fauci and other people. And it's important that you cover both your nose and your mouth. You need to know when to wear a mask. And for this pandemic, that's anytime you're indoors, anywhere, unless you're with immediate family or people that you have lived with, that you know to be safe. The CDC just yesterday released new information and said that there are limited cases where COVID can spread past 6 feet. Usually it's in poorly ventilated areas or in times where you're breathing heavier from like singing or exercise. On the 22nd of September, US deaths topped 200,000 people. That would be equivalent to more people than live in Knoxville, more people than live in Chattanooga. You could take Clarksville and where I'm from in Cheatham County and put those together and still have more people. So just remove those from your state. So this is a very significant thing. Also on the 28th of September, global deaths topped 1 million people. That's taking entire countries away. If you take the number of the population of countries like Iceland, the Bahamas, the Netherlands, the US Virgin Islands, and you put those together and you have 1 million people gone. So I think that the gravity should supersede any political division. And I think it's imperative for us to carefully and critically evaluate the information that we're provided. Just this afternoon, when I was coming in on NPR, they were discussing COVID, and there was a study of over 200 collaborators around the world, and they wanted to see why people are not following health guidelines. Like if there are certain countries where they are, certain countries where they aren't, and if there are common denominators that determine this and why it's political. And so one of them was New Zealand has been applauded for handling the pandemic more effectively than other countries. And this study of the 200 collaborators suggested that one of the reasons it was so successful is because the country had national buy-in, that there was a national identity attached to the pandemic, so that people weren't divided, people wanted to buy in and help each other. And they were on board with the guidelines to help mitigate the decline and the spread of the illness. But if it was framed as a political issue, as it has been here, and as it's also been in Brazil and other countries, there's less buy-in and more division and more skepticism that it's even a real event, that it's a hoax, that there are other issues involved, which are things that have been put out there in social media, in the news, and in other areas. I thought that was very interesting as a country, because that's something that I've wondered too. Why don't we just get it? Why is it something that we don't understand? I said that I would come back to this, and so I'm going to come back to this. When President Trump went into the hospital, when he tested positive and he was taken by helicopter to Walter Reed, there were several staging things that are standard propaganda that happened for him during this time. One of the things that he did was sending out videos and messages to assure us that he was fine. I'm okay, I've got this, but I'm good, I'm all right. This is just precautionary. Another thing was the information coming from Dr. Conley and the other physicians who attended him was we were getting partial information, just enough things. And remember, we said we need full transparency, we need specific, concise language. And then there was a photo opportunity where the president was still working, because we want as a nation to know that our president's fine. He's okay, he's got this, but he's still working. And he was signing blank papers. And again, that's a staging opportunity that's propaganda in nature. So, you know, there are things that happen with this, and multiple examples that, you know, in discussion, if you want more examples of propaganda that's happened or more things, then, you know, we can definitely discuss that when we get to the question and answer period. But I think that as a whole, if you look at those different tips and techniques to keep you grounded so that you keep your emotion out as much as possible when you're looking at these scary events that are happening, and you stick to the scientific facts and you stick to credible sources, even if it's a little extra work, that it's going to be worth it. And that's the crux, the condensed version of what I have for you for this point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nichols. I appreciate that enlightening sort of look at the remarkable problems that have emerged, as you say, from sort of focusing on this as a political issue rather than as a health issue, which it clearly is. It's remarkable, really, when one thinks about it, that something like this that so obviously concerns the health of the entire world could be subverted into you know, a divisive issue in an election year. It's just remarkable. Okay, let's go ahead and move on, if we can, to Professor Ritchart, and we'll get her comments in. And then if any of you do have questions, if you want to send them to me in the chat. I'll be happy to field, send those off to the panelists, and we'll move through that section. Amy?
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ins and outs of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news from a sort of journalism perspective. And this is super important because journalism is a market-driven system in the United States, but it is one of the foundational principles or underlying forces. It's considered essential to democracy. So you have a market-driven system that's protected by the First Amendment. So it's kind of a unique situation. Oftentimes you'll hear that there are people writing about and talking about we are in a post-truth sort of society. And in journalism, we kind of approach it like it's more like post-fact, because obviously truth is truth. But post-fact, we're in an era where people can't agree what is fact. So we're in a post-fact where people are disputing what is fact. And this goes back to what Dr. Nichols said when we're talking about who we trust about information in COVID. So there are some particular challenges as far as reporting on misinformation and disinformation, which Dr. Hicks-Goldston alluded to earlier in her remarks. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how journalists see things, and then what are some strategies for both newsrooms, but also this is important if you're not a media professional and you're a consumer. Everyone is a consumer of mass media. So knowing these things will help you look for sources that you can follow for your news. So a little bit about terms. Dr. H, she talked about misinformation and disinformation. So disinformation is a calculated information that's meant to spread false information. And misinformation in journalism, we often see on Twitter, especially from journalists who are simply retweeting or repeating something that someone has posted without checking the facts. So we like to say in journalism that the audience is on Facebook or TikTok, but journalists are talking to each other on Twitter. So if I want to know what the other journalists are doing, I'm on Twitter with my Twitter journalists, but getting the message out on Twitter is a little bit of a different subject. And what happens is misinformation finds its way onto social media, and then journalists and a lot of times entertainers or commentators will just repeat the information. And so it's not calculated to spread disinformation, but it's misinforming people. And they have large followings, and then it gets to be trending. So we also talk about fake news. So you'll hear people say, oh, that's fake news. Fake news is not just what you don't like or something that's inaccurate. That's not fake news. That's a mistake. So fake news is when misinformation or disinformation is spread and it looks like news. So in my previous example, we're talking about Twitter. If you have a well-respected journalist on Twitter who is retweeting something, that is fake news. They're representing that they're a journalist and they're tweeting information, and there's an underlying assumption that that information has been vetted. So you will also see disinformation, and disinformation can be fake news when it's actually created to look like news. So we have disinformation campaigns in which we have organizations that are claiming they're media, we're a media organization, or we're a news organization, but they're actually spreading disinformation that looks exactly like what our state media or other authentic media look like. So that's fake news. It's misinformation or disinformation that is being represented as news. So we also talk about the media. So I hear that all the time, the media. Media is actually plural. So there is no like the media. There are many media organizations, and in those organizations, you're going to have fake news. You're going to have websites that are spreading propaganda, but you're also going to have local news and national news. So you have to be able to drill down and find out what your sources are and who is reporting on verifiable information and who is spreading misinformation or disinformation. So moving on. So one of the challenges that we have is everything being all mixed together. And so that is a particular challenge. We used to have newspapers, and they were printed, or nightly news, and then we would have commentary on the weekends where they would just do commentary. Or in newspapers, you would have a thing that said editorial, opinion. Now everything's mashed together and consumers have to figure out what is what. So it puts an extra burden on the community, the country, to figure these things out. So the unique challenge with journalism and misinformation that Dr. Hicks-Goldston alluded to is that essentially to report on misinformation or disinformation, you have to repeat it. And the act of repeating it in itself is furthering the message of the misinformation and the disinformation. However, it's important for people to be able to know and judge what is misinformation and disinformation, so you can't just ignore it. So it's a unique, catch-22. So there has to be some strategies about how you do that. Dr. HG talked about our previous work in fact-checking. There has been a huge growth in fact-checking. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more in depth. I'm going to talk a little more in depth about how journalism organizations can innovate and change and modernize so that they're not just relying on fact-check organizations. So one of the things that we have now, one of the situations, is that we have fact-check organizations and then we have journalism organizations. But if you think about journalism, that should also be a fact-checking organization. And there are some things that journalism organizations can do, news organizations, to be part of that and not make it separate. It doesn't necessarily have to be separate. And I do have a research, which I'm not going to share my screen at all because it can be very cumbersome for y'all. But if you would like to follow up with me, I do have a link to a pretty extensive list of fact-checking organizations.
Amy,
So
maybe we could offer those to Dr. Winters and he could share them with all the students.
yes, that would be terrific. I have notes too that I can share with y'all. Okay, so in journalism, one of the primary things that has been a little bit eroded is the journalist as the expert. So when we talk about journalism, I hammer home, I try to emphasize that everything that you say should be fact-checked. So you cannot be a journalist on Twitter and just be ranting and spouting off on Twitter, because you have to verify every single thing that you put up. And so essentially journalists have to become experts in what they're reporting. So when I was looking at some of these examples that I'll circle back to later, like QAnon, I follow journalists who are experts in QAnon and who have reported in depth on QAnon. The same can be said for medical and science writers relative to COVID. So, and a lot of work has been done. I know Dr. H, she talked about The Atlantic, but The Atlantic has done some incredible work about COVID. So if you read The Atlantic, they've got some incredible stuff there. So what we talk about in journalism when we think about, should we repeat this or should we not repeat this? Like, is this a story or is it not, is the tipping point. So when we look at a tipping point, we want to look at, is this common knowledge enough that the majority of the people that we are viewers, listeners, readers, whatever, have they likely heard of this? Is this trending on Twitter? Is this all over social media? Have people been talking about it in conversation? And that's obviously a judgment call, and it depends on the community that you're reporting about. So if you're local or national, or if you're political or science writer, but there has to be a tipping point, because you do not want to be repeating something that would be more in the fringe. And there's a great media bias chart by Media Bistro, which I can put that link in the notes too, but it will show you what is more in the mainstream. And then as you go to the right and the left, it'll show you how things become fringe. And then it'll show you like things that are not even legitimate, that are mostly misinformation or disinformation. And so you have to kind of get a sense for, is this on the fringe, or is this something that is ready to be brought into the mainstream? Because regardless of whether or not you're reporting that it's not true, repeating it, the more times people hear it, the more they're going to think it's true, even if you're saying it's false. There are some other key things that you can do is make the editorial decisions based on news value. So talk about the issues, not the people. So one of the things we talk about in election reporting is horse race reporting and personalities and people bickering. Well, what about talking about the issues and the platforms that affect your audience, your readership, your viewership, your listeners? And so what you should do is focus on community journalism and the public good rather than going on about he said, she said, he insulted this person. The other thing you don't ever want to do is link to problematic content. So a lot of these disinformation bots, they're making money every time somebody clicks on their item. So I'll see people in class and they'll say, oh, did you see that video? It was wrong, it was inaccurate. And I'm like, did you click on it and watch it? And if they say yes, then they have contributed to the spread because people are making money off of this misinformation and disinformation. So in covering news, you never want to link to the content because that is just going to spread it even further. You shouldn't obviously repeat it, but also you shouldn't put it in headlines. So when you see it on the web or you see it on social media, you should not repeat the misinformation in the actual headline because people don't read down further. They're going to just see that and then they're going to repeat it. They'll be like, oh, I saw that on the AP, but it was just the headline and they didn't read the story. And I know Twitter had an initiative. I haven't seen it lately, but they had an initiative where they would ask you to read the story before you shared it. So I don't know if y'all ever got any of those messages. But when you go to share a news item, it will say, please read this news item before you share it, like all the way to the end, not just like the first paragraph. So we talk about tipping points. The other thing is you can rely on experts. And this is what Dr. Nichols talked about a little bit. She talked about who are the experts. And one of the things that is helpful is that we tend to think of like this misinformation and disinformation and like cable news. But there are all sorts of other media organizations. And for example, if you're in Nashville, we have our own experts in these fields. One of them that comes to mind that I follow is Dr. Hildreth at Meharry Medical Center. He tweets a lot about COVID and he's done a lot of press conferences. And so if they're reporting in the national news about a trial, a clinical trial or whatever, I'll go see what he has to say. So that would be a local source that you could contact or follow if you're looking for legitimate information. So rely on your experts. The other thing is make sure that you drill down on anything that you see. And so I'm going to give an example from my own personal, observations. But I saw on Twitter during the protests, the recent protests, where there were all these tweets going out about how people were getting kidnapped. People in Oregon were getting kidnapped by unmarked cars. And I said, that's a really big story. I wonder if it's true. So I clicked on it and there were no sources in the story. And it was a media organization that had posted it and there were no sources. And I was like, okay, could be true, but there's no sources. So I had to actually spend 5 or 6 minutes tracking back to the different stories. And I found the New York Times report of it. And in the New York Times, they quoted public radio, Oregon Public Radio. And so to me, then I could go to public radio. And if you're not familiar, we have market-driven media and then we have public radio, and public radio is partially funded by the government. And studies have shown that in places where there's more funding, more government funding for media, there is more issue coverage and there is more fact checking. So to me, I said, okay, well, if public radio reported it, I need to read what they're saying. So it turned out that they did have a case of this happening. But then later, Snopes, as a fact-checking organization, went back, and you can read on Snopes. You can look up this on Snopes. And Snopes did what is something that more media organizations should do, and they took the entire thing bit by bit and explained what happened. And so what happened was there is one claim of this happening, and it was well documented, but there are no other claims. And if you read the entire story, it's not really clear whether or not it's true or not, because the claim was that the people didn't identify themselves. But what they didn't do was identify themselves to the crowd. So you would have to do more research to find out if they identified themselves to the actual people that they were dealing with. Like you need body cam footage and things like that, which is a pain to get because you have to subpoena it. But anyway, so you have to drill down. And so that's a small example of what it takes to figure out what's going on when you see something on Twitter. And so as a journalist, you have to always be thinking about that. And so Dr. Nichols talked a lot about COVID-19. So I'm not going to talk as much about COVID-19, but the particular example that I looked into is QAnon. And QAnon is a good example because it kind of follows the path of when the mainstream media started to report on it. So in 2017, QAnon was sort of fringe. So journalists knew about QAnon, but nobody was really reporting on QAnon because it was still considered fringe and no one really wanted to repeat the message. There was, I think, I'm pretty sure it's the New York Post that did an in-depth story on them. And then there's one New York Times writer who's written about them a lot. And so what the reporters did is they were looking for the tipping point. They were watching it, they were following it. And as you know now, it becomes clear that QAnon has moved to the point where it is no longer fringe. People know about it and it's part of the main conversation. So now when you report on QAnon, you still have to follow, you know, good practices, but you're at least not giving publicity to an organization that is little known. And so that's really important. And the other thing about QAnon is it's clearly political reporting. So you're clearly in the realms of political reporting when you talk about QAnon. So that's an example. And then I'm going to read you a tweet just to kind of wrap up what I've been saying from Shane Bauer. And if you all read Mother Jones, Shane Bauer is a famous journalist, award-winning journalist at Mother Jones. So he's an expert in the field. And he tweeted on August 28th, investigative journalism can be really exciting, but it can also be really tiresome. In order to write the clause, mostly white police force, I spent 2 to 3 hours looking up every cop on a roster to count how many of them were white. And that was, of course, after waiting weeks to get the roster from the police department before he could do that. And so that just kind of drives home the magnitude of what you have to do just to write those 3 words. I guess it's 4 because mostly white is hyphenated, but you get the point. So that is a little bit about journalism and misinformation and disinformation. And hopefully you can use some of that as you make judgments about what you watch, read, listen to, and spread on social media.
Thank you so much, Professor Ritchart. That's an excellent sort of introduction to that curious, as you say, sort of a catch-22, where it's really impossible to talk about this without somehow contributing to it. And what an uncomfortable and awkward place that journalists find themselves in nowadays, and being in that situation. We do have one question waiting to be answered, and that question is addressed to Dr. Nichols. Taking into consideration the effect of viewing COVID-19 as a political issue or a health issue, how do you believe the United States or any other nation can properly shift their perspective with this bombardment of disinformation and misinformation?
I don't think you're going to like my answer. I think that at this point, we cannot shift it, because what's happened now is that people have attached their viewpoints so much that where persuasion is concerned, you're not anything that I said tonight reinforced what somebody thought. The only people I may have changed their opinion about COVID-19 and what happened are the people in the middle. And as we know, unfortunately right now, there are very few people in the middle. So I think it would be very challenging to change the narrative and to have people move to where this is where it should be, and that is a medical focused crisis event. However, you know, there are if the president tomorrow said, I'm changing things because I've experienced this, and now I expect everyone to wear a mask, I expect everyone to do all of these things that we have been saying, the science community and the medical community have been saying from the beginning we need to do, then there may be a possibility that you might see a slight shift. But I honestly think that people are just going to be reinforced with their own personal opinions.
Thank you very much. Another question for you. Do you have any information or can you offer any explanation for why certain countries have approached COVID-19 in a less political way than the U.S. has?
I think that maybe those countries are not dealing with so many issues that we are as a younger and newer country. And right now we have, as you, Dr. Winters, mentioned at the very start of this, we have such a storm of things happening, from social unrest to issues with the economy to a pandemic to a polarized political climate. I think that countries who have those issues are more inclined to be polarized and political, as opposed to countries who may not be experiencing all of those things.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any follow-up to Dr. Hicks-Goldston? Is there anything that you wanted to follow up?
Yes, I was going to say, I wanted to speak with Kamea, are you there?
I'm here.
I was going to talk to Kamea here for a minute. We've been talking about there were two things everyone talked about in 2020. One was COVID-19 and the other was Black Lives Matter. And you and I have talked a lot about Black Lives Matter and the slant on social media. What do you think has been one of the areas in which you felt there was a lot of disinformation or misinformation on social media or in the news?
I think that a lot of people see the protests and they see the looting, and the first assumption is that the movement is violent, and that's not the case. 93% of the 10,000 plus protests that happened this summer were nonviolent, and the only time that violence was brought out was because of counter groups, like white supremacists or Trump supporters, and the police. So I think a lot of people have only seen what they want to see, and they see that through Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and they share it, then you look and see what's happening on the news. And of course, the news is going to give you the angles of what they want you to see, so that, the Black people that are walking in these protests look bad. So that's one thing. I think another thing is a lot of people think that Black Lives Matter is anti-police, and that's not the case. Black Lives Matter has always been about getting justice for the Black lives that are no longer here. The names that we do know, the names that we don't know. Defunding the police is a big, big part of Black Lives Matter. So defunding the police does not mean that we are abolishing the police. It does not mean that we're doing away with law enforcement. Defunding the police is taking the billions of dollars, billions with a B, and putting that money elsewhere, putting that money into providing shelters for homeless people, so they don't have to sleep on the streets. Providing money for funding money into hospitals, funding money into the poor areas that people won't dare to go to because they're afraid they'll get shot or something drastic like that. But Black Lives Matter has never been anti-police ever.
So much of what you're saying is, to me, reminding me of what Dr. Nichols had said of people have already formed their opinion about something. In this case, they've formed their opinion about Black Lives Matter. And do you think that some of the disinformation allows for that to continue? Would you say that's part of it?
Yeah, and I say that because, like you said, people have already formulated their opinion. based off of what they're seeing, based off of what they're reading, because they don't want to actually go for it and actually do the research and do the work that it takes to like formulate their own opinion. They're basing their opinion off of a tweet that went viral or a Facebook post that went viral, or something that's on Instagram one day, or one of their friends probably posted it and theirs is like, and from that friend, they got like that friend found a screenshot and posted it and was like, okay, look at this. And it just starts making the rounds. So the sad part is I don't think it's ever going to go away because people are very stuck in their way of thinking. And that's not something that anyone can change.
One of the things that I wanted to, and I hinted at it in the beginning, but one of the things that I've said is if we started media literacy from the time we were young, and all of the practices that have been mentioned here tonight from Professor Ritchart and from Dr. Nichols, and now I'm finally getting there of saying, if you started at a young age and from the very beginning you were told to always investigate where you found this story, always find out who first started the story, and do what they call the due diligence. If from the time you were little, in addition to having to learn, reading, writing, arithmetic type of thing, but you from the very young age were told, don't believe everything you see. And it doesn't mean you have that's the thing, you're going through this area where it's like, we're not saying don't trust the man, don't trust authority or whatever, but we're also saying when you hear these things from the very young age, you're taught to think about them, not just blindly accept. Would that be a change?
I think so. I think media literacy should be in every single school, like especially with how much of a mess the educational system is. Like there should be a lot of classes that should be offered that aren't offered because there's something more important to learn. Like I'm 22 and I don't know how to do my taxes.
Now,
Like
keep in mind, that's probably the truth for a lot of people hearing on this first.
Like I didn't get to take a home ec class in high school. Like I know a bunch of people who are like, yeah, I took home ec in school. Like I didn't get to do that at my school. Like, I had to take PE and government. I took a government class in high school. Not a lot of people can say that, but like I was taking simple classes that were a part of the requirements that I had to have to graduate. But like I think if we had a media literacy course in a high school, in like even in middle school, I think that especially like a lot of these kids that are coming up now, I think they're like, that'll be the first time that they actually get to use their own opinions instead of what their parents have taught them or what they've learned from their parents. And I think it would help tremendously.
I think you have a point there of getting your own, what they call it, the youth voice. In service learning, we call it the youth voice. When you first become your own agent and you realize you're not somebody's kid, but you have your own thoughts and you'd like to express them. Yeah.
I have a couple of other questions that have come in.
Sorry to cut you short, Kamea. Thank you.
Sorry, Kamea.
Cool.
I didn't know if you were finished or not. Kamea.
No, it's cool, Dr. Winters. You're good. You're good.
Okay. All right. I thought we were sort of at a pause there. So I'm going to throw this next question is actually for Professor Ritchart. Are you advising the general educated reader not to read things that might be controversial on the internet unless we first check to see whether that article has been vetted or fact checked?
Yes, that actually is what I advise. I mean, there's always the danger when we talk about a double-edged sword is you do have to be educated about what people are doing. So you do have to know what forces of misinformation and disinformation are out there. But in general, we have a large amount of people who do not check anything out, and they'll see, I can't believe this story, click here, and then they'll click on it and read it, and it'll be, misinformation or disinformation. So you can't follow everything online and on social media. So I advise choosing a variety of sources and just following those sources. And I also advise people not to follow them all day long constantly and have them pushing to your phone. But if you check in the morning and you read or look at or listen to 2 or 3 sources, and then you check in the evening and you listen to 2 or 3 sources, you're going to see that those sources are all really reporting. You're going to see a lot of the same stories, but you're getting the story from different perspectives. So yeah, I think that I do believe that clicking on clickbait because you think it's funny or you think it is inadvisable.
I guess that's the catch-22 for us then, as sort of educated viewers, is we see something like that, and unless we click on the link to see the full story, it's difficult to know whether it's been vetted or fact-checked. And once you've clicked on it, then you've supported that whole substructure. Is that sort of the effective?
Yeah, that's actually true. But a lot of times you can see where the source goes by just looking at the link. So sometimes it's not identifiable and you have to click on it because you don't know what, you don't know what it is. But so like, for an example, my husband saw this story on Facebook and he showed me the link and I was like, well, this is where it goes. And you Google whatever that is, and it's easy to see that it is a Canadian far-right propaganda website that is disseminating that information. And so, yeah, I did Google search it. So there's that aspect of promoting it. But I didn't click on the organization webpage and I didn't click on the link because you could tell. So sometimes you can tell. Like, they've retweeted the New York Times. Well, you can click on the New York Times, but sometimes that's true. You don't know that you've stumbled upon misinformation or disinformation until you click on it. So there's no way to avoid all of it. But I would say that most people don't avoid any of it, so that making any effort makes a difference.
I mean, I'm always afraid to click on anything because I'm afraid I'm going to download some virus or something. I mean, it's not even more distressing than the fake news in a way, is that it might destroy my computer. So, I'm really reticent to click on any of those links that I get for anything. Okay, question for Kamea. Let's see. All right. So are you saying that none of the violence that occurred in the 7% of protests, that smaller portion, are you saying that none of that violence came from Black Lives Matter protesters?
Quite frankly, that was, like, in the articles that I read, I never saw anything mentioned about these other 7%. Based on what I have watched and what I have read, I never saw anyone get out of hand unless it was spurred on by somebody else. And being violent does not have to constitute as throwing punches or spitting in someone's face and what have you. It could have been a argument that spiraled out of control. That I have seen. So I'm probably not answering the question in the quote unquote right way. But I've that 7%, you're gonna have to ask them, because I don't have the answer.
Okay.
Quite frankly, because I really can't call them and be like, so were you part of the 7% that didn't get into that got into an altercation this summer?
Understood. So, and then a sort of follow-up to that, how is defunding the police not anti-police?
Defunding the police means taking the money that they receive. They receive billions of dollars, and what for? When they are taking action into their own hands and lives are being taken. So defunding the police means putting the money into other communities, specifically black and brown communities, or poor communities that are having to bust their, can I cuss? I don't know if I can cuss. Can I cuss?
Don't on APSU-TV.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Busting their butts to make ends meet every day. So defunding the police is not anti-police, simply because if you're anti-police, that means you're anti-law enforcement, which Black Lives Matter is not. What I think Black Lives Matter is anti of is they're anti-Black lives dying simply for the fact that they are Black people. That's what Black Lives Matter is anti. If billions of dollars going to what exactly?
But do you think that defunding the police is a question? Do you think that defunding the police, though, is a term that's rhetorically maybe loaded, so that when you're...
I think it's loaded. Yeah, it's very loaded. Just like Black Lives Matter is a very loaded slogan, because I think a lot of people would think that Black Lives Matter is simply saying that Black lives are worth more. That's not, what the slogan is saying. It's a sentence, Black Lives Matter. My life matters just as much as yours, as much as Dr. Nichols, as much as Professor Ritchart, as much as Dr. Winters. Like, this is not, there's not a question of whether my life matters or not. Like, defunding the police, like, again, guys, billions of dollars. Like, this is a lot of money.
I understand that, but I mean, I can say just from personal experience that local law enforcement is seriously underfunded in Montgomery County and Clarksville.
In big, like, I'm talking about like big cities like LA,
Chicago, LA,
New York,
like
Chicago,
right.
Big cities like that. Like,
sure.
LA has $4 billion in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So like, and the LAPD is like one of the most notorious police departments around. So like, and that money could be going towards helping the vast homeless population in LA.
Right. Okay, good. Well, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and I want to offer all four of you the opportunity to, if you have any sort of final comments you'd like to say to kind of wrap things up.
I'm very happy that whoever was able to tune in tonight and be with us came and shared this time with us. Please just remember what I think all of us have been trying to say, and I won't preview everybody else's. What we need now are engaged citizens, and engaged citizens are careful about their choices, do their homework, as we've been trying to say, about what they're reading and who wrote it, and are aware of not spreading false information because they've already vetted that it wasn't false information. And hopefully, if you're taking care of your own media consumption and you're doing your due diligence, you can also maybe help out your roommate or help out somebody, a friend, someone in your family, and just make sure that you kind of demonstrate to them what being engaged means. And it means doing your follow-up and doing your vetting about what you're reading and what you're consuming and what you're sharing. That's the main thing. We proceed with caution.
Dr. Nichols?
I would say ditto to everything Dr. HG just said, but I would also add, don't be afraid to dig in and to think of things beyond your own perspective, to look at the big picture and to look at it with careful examination and with a critical level of thinking that is what I think we expect from an honors program and from our students, because you're the next generation and you can make a difference. And I have no doubt that you will.
Good. Yes. Thank you. I appreciate hearing those words. Professor Ritchart.
I would just like to add my little plug for supporting local journalism. If anyone's ever been in any of my classes or around me in my office, you'll hear my spiel about how people want to focus on national issues and the White House and the Senate. But what about those senators that are right here in our community? And especially as university students, the people who have the most influence on your lives as university students, your education component is the state. So we are right down the road from Nashville. And what is important is to look at local issues because they affect your public safety, they affect your education. Our own health department has been instrumental in COVID. If you look at, I'm on Twitter a lot with other journalists, and in Montgomery County, you can just drive up and get a COVID test. You can't do that everywhere. And they were shocked when I said, oh yeah, my husband just drove down and got a COVID test. And so focusing on your local government is just as important as talking about national issues. So support local journalists who are on the ground in their community doing the work to keep people informed.
Thank you for saying that. And also, you know, you guys all know, if you've been in PELP with me, those city council meetings are available. Go to your city council meetings. They're being broadcast over the web right now. So, you know, you can make comments, find out who's in your, who's the representative from your ward. Same for the county commission. You know, find out what's going on and what these people are representing and what they're doing. Kamea, do you have anything you'd like to say to wrap things up?
Vote on November 3rd.
Thank you. Absolutely. Regardless of where you stand politically, please get out and vote.
And do the work, please. Go read a book.
Yes. Always. I want to thank, again, all 4 of the participants this evening. And a special thank you to Dr. Hicks-Goldston for keeping this moving forward and making sure that it happened. Most appreciative to all of you who showed up this evening to listen to this panel. Please tell your friends about it. It will be available ultimately on APSU-TV, and when that happens, I'll be happy to send out a link.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all again, and have a great evening.
Thank you.